if they get to that point where we have a scene where two Republicans are reading out a list of names, and who knows who's on that list, right? But I mean, we're told they're very high profile, successful, wealthy people, etc. That could be quite the moment for this whole country, actually, not just the administration.
Hey guys, good to see you. How are you?
Hi, great to be with you guys.
Good, good. Have you guys got your new school bags and your shiny shoes ready? There's a back to school vibe in the city this week, isn't there?
Yes, both for my kiddos and it seems the members of Congress down at the Capitol.
They have come back ready and raring for action, it seems. Whether any action will actually follow, well, let's have a good chat about that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. When I was thinking about Congress being back in session here, I thought so much about President Trump's influence over Congress and just what role they actually have to play. And, you know, they've been sidelined in so much of the legislative process because President Trump is legislating by executive order so often. But then again, Congress does have an important role to play, especially in hearings and in some oversight roles. So it could be a particularly interesting fall.
I think not to jump the gun here. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, obviously, but I think just the continued saga over the Jeffrey Epstein controversy and the Jeffrey Epstein's files has been so interesting to watch. And, you know, Congress very much left town to try and avoid talking about the issue. But here we are back in September, and it's still front of mind for a lot of people. And I think one of the most interesting things to see this week is just how much this has made of, you know, strange bedfellows, of some of these members of Congress. We saw Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is an ally of President Trump, standing with California Democrat Ro Khanna and survivors of Epstein outside the Capitol, talking about, you know, demanding transparency around these files. And these are not lawmakers we typically see together. For me, it just really showed that this is an issue, try as the White House might to quash it, to quiet, you know, the controversy around it. They just simply can't make it go away.
Yeah, that was extraordinary for me watching that when you had Representative Ro Khanna from California, a Democrat who ordinarily would really have nothing in common with Marjorie Taylor Greene. As you say, she's such a close ally. She's such a representative of that hard MAGA line. And he was standing there outside the Capitol building, praising her for her bravery, her courage, her leadership. These are all words I don't think we've ever heard a Democrat say about Marjorie Taylor Greene in particular. And, you know, they were heartfelt and meaningful at the time that he was saying them. And I felt that that was quite a turning point in the whole Epstein saga, if you like, because, you know, as you said there, Courtney, they went home early to avoid this and to try and put the lid back on the box. And then all of a sudden it's out. There's 4 Republicans have agreed to side with the Democrats at the time we're recording anyway, to sign this petition to have the files fully released. They just need 2 more Republicans to join in, and all of those files will be put forward. And as Marjorie Taylor Greene put it herself this week, you know, because there are kind of other mechanisms proceeding through various committees to put out various bits and pieces of the files. But her point was, don't pick one over the other. Vote for everything. If you are true to yourself about getting the information out there, about listening to these survivors and, you know, being transparent, vote yes to everything. Don't be selective. And that's quite a hard point, I think, for Republicans, especially those who have been on this Epstein issue for so long, to not listen to her on that one.
I think it's been also extraordinary to see, and I've been really interested to watch how President Trump and the White House have been reacting to all of this. I mean, we did an episode here on the pod about the Epstein files, and I remember we asked then, okay, will we still be talking about this in 4 weeks, 6 weeks? And indeed, it comes back in full force. As you said, Courtney, it's something the White House can't seem to move past. And it's fascinating because you see, you know, these images of these women who were victims of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell telling really emotional stories. And at the same time, President Trump repeats a line we heard earlier in the summer, which is that he said this is a Democrat hoax. And we understand that the White House has also been calling, Republican members of Congress to say, if you vote to bring this measure forward, which would compel the Department of Justice to release these files, that would be considered a hostile act. And this, again, is one of those issues where I just think it has muddied political waters so much, and the traditional, really entrenched left-right lines that we've seen characterize pretty much everything in this town at this point. I think that can also be said perhaps about the Republican voter base as well. And I'll be really interested to see, whether polling on this issue, if that moves over the coming weeks, and how voters in particular see this issue, because it's not going away. And this is an incredibly strong voice that we're hearing with the survivors together. And it's obviously something Democrats think that they can, in one way, as horrible as it is to say this, capitalize on certainly the Republicans' reticence to release these files.
And, it'll be interesting to see, Katrina, as you pointed out, Thomas Massie has 4 Republicans as of timing of this recording who have agreed to sign this petition. But, whether they will be able to move forward with this to compel the Justice Department to release more information, or if some of these tactics we've seen by the White House pressure campaign, by Republican members of Congress, we saw them release a tranche of 33,000 documents that they said is showing the transparency, but Democrats argued was just most of the details that came out of that were already publicly known. And that seemed to move some Republicans into the White House column saying, this petition is a moot point. They've released all these documents. So the legislation appears to be stalled at this point. But the question is whether the White House will win out, or Massie and Ro Khanna and this bipartisan push will prevail.
The other thing I think I'll be watching for on that issue is the survivors this week saying that they know who the abusers were, or the associates were. They're going to put together their own list. And the Congress people have said, Congressman Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene notably, have said they will read that list out on the floor of the House when they're protected legally by the privilege that they have from their position. So they would be inured against being sued or whatever, as some of those survivors might be if they said it outside of the chamber. If they get to that point where we have a scene where 2 Republicans are reading out a list of names, and who knows who's on that list, right? But I mean, we're told they're very high profile, successful, wealthy people, etc. That could be quite the moment for this whole country, actually, not just the administration. So yeah, I'll be keeping an eye on that. But alongside that, the Congress people are doing, I suppose, what their primary role is in a way, which is to agree and vote to fund the government, to keep all the federal workers in office, in jobs, getting paychecks, something that they have been unable to do for quite some time now. And, we're less than 4 weeks away from potentially the government shutting down again, unless the Republicans and the Democrats can work together to come up with a funding bill, which seems like a big ask at this point.
Yeah, despite the fact Republicans have control of the House and the Senate, they do need 60 votes in the Senate to keep the government funded, meaning they will need at least 7 Democrats. And I think there's a few dynamics at play this time that really are going to make it a bit different from where we were in March when we last went through this. And I think that is Democrats seem a little more prepared this time. They have already been demanding a meeting between Republican and Democratic leadership and the president, which is typical, right? That's par for the course when you're having budget discussions. But Republicans have so far refused to set that meeting, and Democrats say that's not going to cut it. And you have to remember that last time, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer voted with Republicans to avoid a shutdown in March. And that spurred just furious backlash in his party. So I don't think he'll be willing to provoke his party this time. And they seem inclined to inch towards a government shutdown and try and frame it as a Republican shutdown.
Yeah, and it really is going to be interesting to see what the Democrats do here. They seem to be ready to put up a fight this time. It's not entirely clear from the wording we've seen from Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries so far, but they have made clear they want something in return. Obviously, if they're going to pass a measure to keep the government funded and open. And in return, they want to get rid of some of the Medicaid cuts that the One Big Beautiful Bill has ushered through. Also to add to, funds for rural hospitals. Remember, these are some of the biggest issues that Democrats pointed out in criticizing and voting against President Trump's signature One Big Beautiful Bill. And I thought it was really interesting, kind of in the framework of all of this, that we saw the White House, including senior members of the White House, speaking to Republican congressional leaders when they came back from their break about how to message on this legislation, and they're now calling it, the working families tax cut, or pointing to their districts, or pointing to these members of Congress rather, to go to their districts and talk about what a big tax cut this legislation is. And part of that is because they know Democrats are going to come ready to fight this stopgap measure to keep the government funded, with particularly pointing out the Medicaid cuts from that legislation. So it could get pretty testy, and we have to see what Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries decide they are going to do in this case. But it sounds like this time around it'll be a lot more difficult to get Democrats on board.
And there's an issue within the Republican Party as well, isn't there? Because, the economic policy that we've seen from President Trump and in that big, beautiful bill actually raised spending, raised the debt, all of these things that Republicans are normally against. So promises have been made that whatever funding comes through now will keep spending at or even at a reduced level to where it is right now. Whereas for the Democrats to vote for it, they're looking for spending to be added in, as you've been talking about there, to try and undo some of what's been cut in the summer budget bill. So that's going to be a really difficult, I think, tightrope to walk for the Republican leadership in terms of trying to satisfy both sides of both polar camps, really. The other issue at play here is you have a president who's not afraid of a government shutdown. So he's prepared to go that far. He's already calling it the Schumer shutdown, isn't he? So, if the Democrats don't go with the Republicans, he has the branding and the messaging there all ready to roll out. And you kind of have to wonder, at this point, where is the American public on all of this? Because there's just been, since President Trump came into office, we had that cliff in March, we had the budget bill through June and the start of July, and here we are again looking for another potentially stopgap measure, not even a final funding. So we're facing into a repeat pattern here. And we're also getting quite close to the period at which people start looking at their re-election campaigns, if they're not already looking at them. So that's kind of looming over everyone as well. So I do think we're going to be burning the midnight oil on Capitol Hill in the last few days of September.
As you said, Katrina, timing is everything. And we've heard from Democrats, Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar pointed out that in March, the president was just taking office. He was up in his favorability ratings. And now he seems to be down in some of those approval ratings, right? And so they understand that the political aspect here, of course, is looming over this entire fight. And one other thing I want to mention is just the strategy by the White House to be aggressive about clawing back previously approved spending, which of course is a major sticking point for Democrats. Republicans passed legislation this summer that rescinded about $9 billion in foreign aid and public broadcasting funds, but the president and the White House notified Congress again in late August that they'll use a rarely used maneuver to try and claw back $5 billion in congressionally approved funding for foreign aid, which effectively bypasses Congress's power of the purse. And that's just not going to sit well with a lot of lawmakers on the Hill.
Yeah, it's another one of those. By the way, I think that was your dog agreeing with your point there, Courtney, which we love. It's another one of those rescissions package, which is just, as you said, a fancy word for saying taking back money that had already been approved but has not been spent yet. And, I think the fact that the Trump administration sent, this request for a rescissions package basically a week or so before Congress got back into town here is not perhaps, the message that Democrats were hoping to get or thinking that, that would be the starting point for negotiations on funding the government going forward. So, I mean, it could, again, get quite testy in the next few weeks. There's only, as Katrina, you said, a few weeks away. But, what I think is the really interesting aspect is what you pointed out, Katrina, is the public support and how people see this. Obviously, President Trump and Republicans have said, if the government shuts down, this is the Democrats' doing. But now, several months into this second term of President Trump, voters do know that the president has, not only control of the White House, but of both chambers of Congress, has a conservative majority in the Supreme Court. And if they're unable to keep the government open, it does make you wonder. And by the way, we should mention, we've seen so many federal workers also lose their jobs, so there's that aspect of it as well. But you just wonder if people will make that link and say, okay, the Democrats have dug in their heels, they're the ones shutting the government down, or if they'll look to Republicans and say, with your majority, why can't you get this even stopgap measure through, not even a full funding bill?
You'd have to imagine there's a bit of both out there, right? And given how tight margins are in some of these congressional districts, that's what's going to make the next year even more interesting. But I mean, one of these appropriations bills that we've already seen some of the text on around education looks to take back $2 billion that schools have already included in their budget. So that's going to mean the shutting down of certain programs, reducing of sort of teaching assistants and so on. So if you're Republican or Democrat, you'll start seeing the effect of some of this, if it is passed, really straight away in your life. So, you couple that with Medicaid and a whole host of other things that have happened this year, not to mention tariffs and everything else that we talk about on this pod. I think we talk about when do we reach the point in the road where that support for President Trump changes. We might be getting quite close to it.
Yeah, town halls will be very interesting when these lawmakers are back in their districts.
We saw some of that over the summer as well, didn't we?
Yep. And I think actually to the point that was made about, us being 1 year away from the midterms, part of that strategy of telling GOP lawmakers how to message on the One Big Beautiful Bill is concern about that very point, town halls, about constituents not being happy about some of the cuts that they're seeing to, Medicaid, their health care, to hospitals perhaps, and if they live in more rural areas. And, if the Republicans and President Trump are now saying, okay, go out and sell this legislation as a tax cut, the reality is for many Americans, it's an extension of a tax cut that they had already received during President Trump's first term. So they might not actually see any real tax relief. And some economists we've spoken to have said, well, look, the tariffs are going to actually cancel out or negate any sort of tax relief that some of these Americans might see. So it could be a real tricky line to walk.
So there's a lot of disagreement there. Let's talk briefly more positively about areas where there is agreement. And the big thing that comes to mind, especially given everything else that's going on in the world, is, of course, the Russia sanctions bill in the Senate that Senators Graham and Blumenthal put forward together. Huge, across-the-board bipartisan support for that. Just not from the president at this point in time.
Yeah, as you said, Katrina, it has the backing of at least 85 senators. The president has yet to endorse it. They seemed poised and ready to go, and they were waiting for Trump, and that sort of seal of approval never came. The bill would greenlight aggressive tariffs on Russian goods and their trading partners, and it would boost efforts to freeze assets of top officials and their allies. But the president, this summer, it seemed that he wanted to step in, personally intervene. Unfortunately, his rhetoric hasn't really moved the dial for this conflict. He has repeatedly let his own deadlines to force Russia to end fighting or face economic sanctions quietly pass. He had this 50-day deadline, which he said, Russia would face secondary tariffs. Then he shortened it to 10 to 12 days. And then that led to a meeting face-to-face with Putin in Alaska. But that did not yield any sort of breakthrough that the president had hoped maybe he personally could bring.
Yeah, and you really got a sense before senators left for their break, this reluctance almost among some senators to leave without having resolved and having put this to a vote, because there is such bipartisan support and because the war continues to see Russia really pummel Ukraine from the skies, including civilian targets over and over again, as we've all been covering. And one of the reasons that President Trump really put the brakes on it, and that seems very clear to be what happened, is because he didn't want his hand forced on putting sanctions on President Putin. And, we saw just a few weeks later, of course, the summit in Alaska and the meeting then at the White House. And as you said, Courtney, since then, nothing's happened. And senators will face tough questions now as they're facing reporters back in the halls of Congress to point out that the war continues. And every message we've heard from President Trump, including our colleague Robert Costa, spoke to him this week, and he said, I think something will happen. I think something will happen soon. But he has not answered the question about when sanctions will hit Russia in particular. We've seen the sanctions on India, which have been confounding in many ways, particularly because India is a U.S. ally and not the only country that buys Russian oil and gas. But he seems very reluctant to move forward with sanctions. And senators will be indeed also reluctant to get ahead of the president. So I don't really know how they square that circle.
There is, though, speaking to a couple of senators this week, there is a kind of rising level of anxiety about the timing of all of this. And there's a new Ipsos poll out just in the last week or so that showed more than 60% of the American public is in favor of sanctions being put on Russia and secondary sanctions on oil trading partners. And that survey drilled down into sort of MAGA Republicans, and more than 3/4 of them were in favor of the president putting these sanctions on. So it kind of feels like it's a matter of time in a way, but yet the president is there dragging his feet. And it does seem to be, from the reporting from colleagues around the White House, is that the sanctions bill removes the power the president has, not just to put these sanctions on, but crucially to take them off, that they might not be as easy to remove as the power that he currently has himself now. And despite saying he's not doing it, as you say, Sumi, he has put these sanctions on India already, just by itself. You have to think, is there something else at play there in terms of India? Because it doesn't make sense if you're saying I'm not doing secondary sanctions to then put them on one country, which is not the biggest oil trading partner with Russia, that's China.
And I think all of this sort of speaks to a question of credibility of U.S. economic power, right? Like, we saw Putin in China meeting with the leaders of China, India, North Korea, at a moment when the U.S. sanction power is supposed to serve as this sort of counterweight. So I think the U.S. is certainly being tested, these adversarial countries standing shoulder to shoulder, saying that they are going to be a unified bloc against the U.S. So, I do agree with you. I think that this is going to be a big question that senators are going to have to face as they face reporters.
And in the end, it's all going to be a question of what President Trump wants. If you speak to GOP members of Congress, they really are very mindful of the fact that whatever comment they make, whether it be on Ukraine or other legislative plans, they have to be in line with the White House.
Yeah, I do think, the overarching theme here, the subtext here, whatever you want to call it, is Trump's influence and how he wields it, and whether or not Republicans are going to be successful in implementing that agenda and how voters will receive it.
It's a very different time in Congress, certainly, but I think we've just run out of time. So, we'll get back together and talk about many of Congress's plans in the coming weeks as well. But for now, I guess, got to say goodbye.
Exactly. We will be charting that here every week. So do stay with us on the President's Path. And I'll see you guys next week.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please do leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.